I would like to introduce to you today a distinguished Israeli scholar, Professor Benny Morris from Ben-Gurion University. He will talk today on the creation of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947-1949. Professor Morris was born in Israel in 1948. He grew up in Jerusalem and New York. He served in the Israeli Defense Forces and did his first degree at the Hebrew University and his PhD at Cambridge University. He worked for several years as a journalist in the Jerusalem Post between 1978 and 1990. And since 1997, he's been professor of history at Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba. And since 2015, he's been a visiting professor of Middle East history at Georgetown University. He has published many books, many articles on the Arab-Israeli conflict, including 1948, a history of the first Arab-Israeli war in 2008, Righteous Victims in 1999, and the birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited in 2003. And he has just completed what I understand is a massive book on Turkish-Christian relations between 1878 and 1924. I should say that his book on the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem is a book that really changed the paradigm of the discussion simply by documenting and here we will get into a bit of etymology, the expulsion and or fleeing of Palestinians, about 750,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of the Palestinian population from what was a mandatory Palestine. And I believe that this will be the major topic of his talk today. So please help me welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Omer, and Brown University for inviting me. The creation of the Palestinian refugee problem in the 1948 war was one of the two important outcomes, important historically outcomes of the war. One was, of course, the creation of the Jewish state in the center of the Arab-Muslim world, changing the geopolitics of the region. And the second was the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, important and historically significant because of its persistence to this day, and it still is one of the major obstacles to any peacemaking and one of the driving forces in the Arab enmity towards and campaign against Israel. It's worth noting maybe at the outset, which is not normally said about the refugee problem, that in fact the 48 war created three refugee problems, not one but three. One was the creation of Israeli refugees. 70,000 Jews were displaced in the course of the 48 war from their homes. 70,000 you might think is a small number, was actually 10% of the Jewish community in Palestine at that time. Say 30 million Americans were displaced in a war from their homes in America, 10% of Americans, that would be a significant problem. So 70,000 created Jewish refugees created in the 48 war in Palestine was a problem. It was solved because most of the area earmarked for Jewish statehood, plus some other areas, became the state of Israel. They returned these 70,000, almost all of them, to their former homes, and the problem vanished. There is no Israeli refugee problem from the 48 war. The second refugee problem, which is the one I'm going to talk about here, is the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. But the 48 war created also a third refugee problem, not in 48 itself, but in between 1948 and 1964, and that was the displacement to refugeedom, in fact, of the Jewish communities in the Arab lands, from Morocco, stretching from Morocco through North Africa, through the Middle East, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Syria. They all had large Jewish communities, and all of these essentially vanished or were displaced or were intimidated into flight. That's probably the right word. Some of them were expelled, as in Egypt in 1956, but most of them were simply intimidated into flight as a result of what had happened in Palestine and Israel in 1948, and a vast Jewish refugee problem, probably amounting to about 800,000 Jews who were displaced, was created as a result. That problem, incidentally, no longer exists as well, because these Jews were absorbed. Most of them, the poor, most of them were poor, and the vast majority of them ended up in Israel and were absorbed and became Israeli citizens, however difficult the absorption was. And a small number of them were absorbed in Western countries, in France primarily, and Britain. So that refugee problem no longer exists either. It sort of vanished almost at inception. So one refugee problem remained, and that was, of course, the Palestinian refugees. And the Palestinian refugee problem, the creation of, was the major expression of the collapse of Palestinian society in the course of the 48 war. Under the hammer blows of war and defeat in the 48 war, 700,000 people were displaced. About 700,000. There's an argument about numbers. About everything about this subject is in dispute, and so is the number. The United Nations checked the numbers in 49-50 and came up with 711 or 726,000 Arabs uprooted from their homes in the course of the war. The Jews maintained, Israel maintained, that 520,000 in all had been displaced. Arabs said the number was 900,000 to 1 million. Probably the number the United Nations offered was probably more or less accurate, and that was the number. Today, it's worth noting, I'll just jump to the present for a second. Today, there are over 5 million Arab refugees, Palestinian Arab refugees, on the rolls of the United Nations and its special agency for Palestinian refugees called UNRWA. The 5 million consist of those still alive from the first 700,000, the original 700,000, plus their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. That's how you get to 5 million plus. The Arabs, incidentally, maintain the number is closer to 6 to 7 million of Palestinian refugees. The problem refugees, incidentally, is in a number of ways problematic when applied to Palestinian refugees. It's worth mentioning before going into the origins. One is the second and third and fourth generations are not normally seen in the international community as refugees, as recognized as refugees. Germans who are expelled from the Sudetenland or were expelled from Eastern Europe and other places and ended up in Germany, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were not recognized as refugees, and the same applies to Vietnamese or Poles or others. Usually the descendants are not. In this case, the world community, for political reasons, there's lots of Muslim and Arab states in the United Nations, continue to see them as refugees, which is a problem. The other major problem with the term refugees is if you look at the Oxford Dictionary or any normal dictionary, you'll find that a refugee is somebody who's displaced from his country as a result of war, persecution, religious and whatever. In fact, 2/3 of the 700,000 displaced from their homes in Palestine weren't displaced out of Palestine. They were displaced to other places in Palestine, 2/3. In other words, about 500,000 of the 700,000 odd so-called refugees, or those uprooted in the course of the war, moved to other places in Palestine. They were uprooted from Jaffa. They moved to Shechem or to Nablus. They moved to Jenin. They moved from one part of Palestine to another. They weren't uprooted from their country, and therefore, by normal definitions, they would not be accepted as refugees. And of course, this would certainly pertain to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who still live in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and other parts of Palestine. But we won't go into that. That's a semantic problem, but that's how the world sees it. These are called refugees, those displaced in 48 and their descendants. There are two traditional explanations of why they became refugees, why they were uprooted from their homes. The Arab explanation is very simple. The Arabs say that the Jews intended in the Zionist movement to take over all of Palestine, to dispossess and uproot the Palestinians. And in 1948, given the opportunity of war, they did just that systematically as a matter of policy and threw out most of the Palestinians from the areas which became the Jewish state in the course of that war. It was an expulsion, foreordained, planned, systematic, and this is what happened. That's the Arab explanation of how the refugee problem occurred, basically, and you'll still hear it from Arab commentators, politicians, and so on. That's what happened. The Jewish explanation is a little more complicated, and it says that either they left their homes on their own volition, which is a silly word, but that's the one used, voluntarily, meaning that they fled because of the flail of war. War approached their their threshold, that approached their villages, their towns. They didn't want to be caught up in the war. They didn't want to be subject to Jewish atrocities. They didn't want to live under Jewish rule. And so they fled of their own volition, as the phrase went. Or the Arab leaders themselves asked or ordered or appealed to them to leave for various reasons, one of which might be, according to the Jewish explanation, they wanted to clear the battleground for the future Arab states' armies' invasion of Palestine, which occurred in May 1948. So they told the Arabs of Palestine before that, leave, clear the area. We will then be able, we Arabs will be able to conquer more easily without having to shoot up Arabs along the way. We will be able to invade the country more easily and without harming Arabs. And you will come, you Palestinian refugees who leave now will be able to come back to your homes and, of course, to get Jewish homes when we conquer and throw out the Jews. That was the Jewish explanation of why the Arab leaders called on them to leave, if there were such calls. But that was the Jewish explanation. The records opened by the Israeli state papers, kibbutz archives, local authority archives, and so on in Israel, and the papers opened by the United Nations, the British government, the American government. The British were in charge of Palestine up to the 14th of May 1948, so they were there. These various groups of state and local and private papers, which were opened in the early 1980s, give us a more complex explanation of what happened, though most of it, in the end, and I'll get back to this when I speak in detail of the causes, most of the most important explanation for why the Arabs left was essentially battle. That is, there was a war in 1948, a war launched by the Palestinian Arabs in December 1947, launched a second time when the Arab states' armies invaded Palestine in May 1948. And as a result of this war, the Arabs became refugees. On the fringes, there were expulsions by Israeli troops. There were orders or appeals by Arab leaders, local leaders, for Arabs to flee their homes. But the main cause was the war itself, which generated the displacement. Now, I would say, going into it a little more deeply, that there were several preconditions which led or were necessary in leading to the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. One was that there was a conflict for the previous 50 years, from the beginning of Zionist settlement in Palestine until 1947. There was hostility and conflict between the two populations for the 50 years leading up to that war, which implanted hatred, enmity, distrust, and all the rest of it in both populations, especially, I would say, on the side of the Arabs. And there was much more violence, of course, by Arabs against the incoming Jewish settlers than there was by the settlers against the Arabs up to 1947. This is not disputable, this is fact. But the Arabs, of course, regarded all the Zionist influx up to 1947 as an invasion. Even if it wasn't carried out by force of arms, it was an invasion under British, in some way, British auspices. But this Zionist settlement, Arab antagonism to it, attacks on Jews as a result, is some Zionist retaliatory attacks on Arabs. All of this caused enmity, hatred, and this was a precondition to what was going to happen in 48. A second thing is there was expulsionist thinking in the Zionist camp, especially during the mid-1930s. Zionist leaders, and here I would mention specifically Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, the two leading Zionist figures, did gradually come to understand or believe that it was necessary to achieve transfer of some Arabs or all Arabs from the area which would become the Jewish state. In other words, Zionist immigration to Palestine was not going to be sufficient to constitute a Jewish majority in any area of Palestine which would become a Jewish state. It would have to be supplemented by some form of transfer of Arabs, preferably voluntary, preferably compensated, but a transfer of Arabs out of the area which would become a Jewish state. The Peel Commission, the British commission which investigated the Arab revolt of 1936, had proposed partition of Palestine into two states and had proposed alongside that a transfer a voluntary, preferable, but even compulsory of the Arabs from the area of the Jewish state to be. The Peel Commission, incidentally, earmarked 17% of historic Palestine, that is from the river to the sea, 17% for Jewish statehood, the rest, almost all the rest, for Arab sovereignty. But from that 17%, the Peel Commission said Arabs, or most Arabs, should be removed even compulsorily. And this, of course, reinforced Zionist thinking about and made it sort of even more public. If there's Peel Commission, the commission sent by the rulers of Palestine, the British rulers, who were also a democracy and the fount of democracy, if you like, and liberal enlightened thinking, if they could endorse a transfer, we too can endorse transfer. It gave it moral underpinning, if you like. The Arabs also of Palestine thought in terms of transfer, and we know this certainly from the way their national leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, talked about what he envisioned the future of Palestine to be. It should be all under Jewish Arab rule, and it should have as few Jews as possible. And when asked by the Peel Commission what you would do with the 400,000 Jews who already live here, who just came in the last couple of decades, he said, well, history will tell, and we're not going to give them citizenship. History will tell, and the Commission understood he actually meant to certainly disenfranchisement, but maybe just to expel them or even slaughter them. The Peel Commission wasn't clear about that. It actually compared, the Peel Commission, what he'd said to what Iraqis at the time were doing to Assyrians, to Christians in Iraq, which was some sort of slaughter. And he said maybe this is what can be expected if Haj Amin al-Husseini takes over in Palestine, will happen to the Jews. So there was transfer thinking on the Arab side, which fed Jewish transfer thinking. If they want to kick us out, we'll kick them out. But the driving force among the Jews wasn't this. Those propounding transfer were driven by the desperation and distress of the Jewish minorities in Europe, especially in Germany, but also in Poland and other places where anti-Semitism was on the rise, and what was expected, and they feared the worst. The word Shoah, incidentally, that is Holocaust, begins to appear in Jewish newspapers relating to what is going to happen to the Jews of Europe from 1933. From 1933, it appears in headlines, the word Shoah. That is, they had this sense that terrible things were about to happen, and therefore you needed space for them in Palestine, meaning a Jewish state. And if you had a Jewish state which has a large Arab population which is busy shooting up Jews, that's not a safe haven. So this also, of course, pushed them into thinking in terms of transfer as part of the solution to the problem of a large Arab minority in a Jewish state, a large Arab minority which doesn't want to live in a Jewish state and might actually fight against the Jewish rulers in that state. A third precondition, which is usually overlooked, is the weaknesses, third precondition for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem in the 48 war, was the weaknesses of Arab society. Palestinian Arab society had major faults, major schisms, major problems. It didn't have any democracy. There wasn't any elected leadership. There were a couple of strong families which gained dominance. The Husseini family and their allies gained dominance in the Palestinian Arab national movement, but they weren't legitimate in the sense of democratically elected or supported. They terrorized their opponents inside, so there was a fissure between the Husseini factions and the antagonistic factions, which were called the opposition, led by the Nashashibi clan. There were fissures between Muslim Arabs, 90% of the Arabs of Palestine, and the 10% of Christians who didn't want to live under the Muslims and feared the Muslims. So there was that base, and the Christians were, of course, much better educated than the Muslims and were favored by the British authorities. So there was a problem there of that basic fissure. There was a problem between towns and countryside. Townspeople often looking down on the country people as primitive and whatever. The Bedouins in the country, and there were large numbers of Bedouins, were, of course, not part of regular Palestinian society and were regarded skeptically, or even worse. Bedouins usually stole things from the neighboring villages and so on. So there was a problem between Bedouin sedentary and non-sedentary populations in Palestine. But the main weakness of Palestinian Arab society was an organization. They had a national movement, but without the proper appropriate organizations which can hold together a society and a national movement. not proper running, functioning municipalities, no proper taxation system, no self-defense force, no national self-defense force. Every village had its militia, which meant 20 or 30 people with bad, usually poor guns, but rifles. But they had no national organization, also in the military sense. And when they came against the Jews in 1948, they were fighting with different militias. In other words, 700 militias, the number of Arab villages there were in Palestine, against the united Jewish national militia, which turned into an army called the Haganah. So this lack of organization was very important. As I say, no taxation, no military structure, national military structure, and fissures in the society itself. The last, of course, precondition was the war itself. The 48 war itself was a precondition for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. A war occurs, people fear, people flee, and without the war one can't see how people would have become refugees, but a war made that possible and in some way even necessary. The refugee problem occurred, and it's worth looking at that, in 4 stages. I investigated the subject when I wrote the first book, which came out in 1988, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. I investigated it a second time in 2003, 2004, or in the years before that, when I published the second version of that book called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, which is twice as long as the first version, but much better. It's much better because it's much richer in material. Not the conclusions are exactly the same, but the material which I had available in the second edition was much richer than what I had in the first, because the IDF had opened its archive. The Israeli army and the Haganah had opened their archives. The Israeli state archive had opened up the cabinet deliberations. So I had much better material for the second version, which makes it a much better book, but as I say, a much harder plod. And from this material, and as I say, the material from England, from American archives, United Nations archives, and so on, I reached the conclusion that the refugee problem had been created in 4 stages, had emerged in 4 stages. The first stage was very important. When the Arabs began shooting, the Palestinian Arabs began shooting at the Palestinian Jews in November 1947, immediately after the UN had declared or proposed a partition solution to the problem on the 29th of November, the partition resolution number 181. The Arabs began shooting, and from November 47 until the end of March 1948, probably something like 75,000 Palestinians had fled their homes. This was the first stage in the creation. It was very important because the 75,000 included much of the Palestinian middle class. As during 1936-39, when the Arabs rebelled against the British, in 1936-39, something like 30 to 40,000 Palestinians of the wealthier middle class, upper class, it's the same class, in fact, there's no real difference there, fled to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and other places in that rebellion, and they did the same thing in the beginning of the 1948 war. 75,000 fled, which essentially left the Palestinian masses leaderless and headless. The middle class, the lawyers, the doctors, the pharmacists, most of the politicians, all of them were out of the country within weeks from November, after November 1947. And this left many of the Palestinian masses fearful and leaderless. And they couldn't flee, of course, as quickly because they didn't have money. They weren't going to abandon their fields and go to a hotel in Nablus or in Beirut, because they couldn't afford a hotel in Nablus or Beirut or a second apartment. But the richer people could. So they stayed put until the hammer blows of the Jewish offensives, which began in the beginning of April 1948, hit them, town after town, Haifa, Tiberias, Haifa, and so on. And they also began to flee, because then it wasn't a matter of a little bit of money for rent. It was a matter of your life and your daughters' lives and your wives' lives and so on. So they began to flee. The first stage set the stage for the second stage. And the second stage begins or occurs in April, May, June 1948, and parallels the Zionist shift to the offensive at the beginning of April. The Zionists had been on the defensive until the 4th month, the end of the 4th month, in the civil war part of the war. The first half of the war, until May 48, was a civil war, as I said, between the communities. Afterwards, it's followed by a conventional war, which starts with the Arab invasion, the pan-Arab invasion of the country by the armies of Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. From beginning of April 1948, the Zionists go over to the offensive, partly because they know that in May 1948, the British are going to leave the country and the Arab states are going to invade. And they must finish and defeat the Palestinian Arab militias before the invasion from outside. Otherwise, they face the enemy at the gates on the borders and the enemy within shooting up their supply columns and so on, the Palestinians. So they had to defeat the Palestinians, and they go over to the offensive in the beginning of April. And that offensive includes capturing Arab neighborhoods, Arab towns, Arab villages, which serve as the bases of the Arab militia attacks on the Jews, which had been occurring for the previous 4 months, and involved attacks in which Arab villagers and townspeople essentially fled. Here and there were expulsions, but most of it was just flight as a result of Jewish approach or Jewish attack on particular villages and towns. And that was the mass flight, those 3 months from beginning of April until the end of June 1948. Something like 250 to 300,000 Palestinians, the urban masses and swaths of Arab villages in the countryside flee as a result of Zionist offensives from one area after another. There's a third stage in July in which and by now we're talking about not Zionists, but Israel. The Israeli army goes over to the offensive in July 1948 and in 10 days conquers Lydda and Ramleh and the town of Nazareth, Lower Galilee. And there too, there is mass Arab flight in Lydda and Ramleh. That's the case of the biggest of the expulsions in the 48 war. The Israeli troops expel the population of Lydda and Ramleh altogether. Something like 50,000 people are expelled altogether during July. About 100,000 more Arab refugees are created. And the fourth stage is in October, November 48, when the Zionists or the Israeli army goes over to a number of offensives in the south, the Negev, and in the north, the Galilee, and another 200,000 or so Arabs evacuate their villages. Some are expelled, most flee. And those are the 4 stages in the creation of the problem. Let me add one more important thing, and sometimes I think that that's the most important thing that happened to create the refugee problem, and that was that the Israeli government from June 1948, it never decided on expelling the Arabs. We have the cabinet protocols, we have the protocols of the Jewish Agency Executive, which ruled the Jewish community in Palestine before May 1948. We have much of the material of the IDF from 1948 itself and the Haganah General Staff and so on. No place was there a decision to expel the Arabs of Palestine. It just doesn't exist. It didn't happen. There was no such decision. Had there been such a decision, there would have been a rift in the Israeli government between left and right, the left opposing such a decision, and Ben-Gurion didn't want a split cabinet in the middle of a war. But what there was from June 1948 was a decision by the Israeli government, reiterated in the following months, in August and September again, in official cabinet decisions, not to allow the refugees to return en masse. They said, well, maybe some refugees can return at the end of the war if there is a peace agreement between Israel and the Arab states. That'll be part of the peace agreement. But there will be no return of Arab refugees in the course of the war, because they will be a fifth column if they come back. They are people who have been fighting against us. If they come back, they will again start shooting at the road, at the convoys along the roads, shoot at our troops as they're trying to fend off the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Jordanians. We will not allow a mass refugee return before war's end, and only as part of a peace treaty if there is one eventually. So that was an important decision which is worth taking note of, which in some way assured the perpetuation of the refugee problem. You can say that the other half of that cause of perpetuating the refugee problem was that the Arab states did not absorb the refugees. The Jews wouldn't take them back into their area, which became the state of Israel. The Arab states refused to absorb them, as Germans had absorbed German refugees, or Turks had absorbed Turkish refugees in previous decades, or Greeks had absorbed Greek refugees. The Arab states did not absorb their brothers from Palestine. In Lebanon, they didn't give them citizenship. In Syria, they didn't give them citizenship. In Jordan, eventually, they gave them citizenship, but kept them as second-class citizens, and so on. So there was no proper absorption in the Arab states. The reasons for it, incidentally, are quite they're complex but simple. The Arab states said if we start absorbing Palestinian Arab refugees, this will end the refugee problem, and we want to maintain the refugee problem as a battering ram against the Israelis in the United Nations, in propaganda. We can also use Arab refugees as potential terrorists against Israel. So they had reasons to perpetuate the refugee problem. Also, they didn't want to absorb Palestinian Arab refugees. They never liked the Palestinians, especially before that. They certainly didn't want an embittered minority joining their countries and destabilizing their own regimes, which is what happened. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon destabilized Lebanon in the 1970s and 80s, leading to a civil war in Lebanon. They did the same in Jordan in 1970 in the famous Black September clash between the PLO, the Palestinians, and the Jordanian government. So the Arabs were right in taking in these, if they were taken in and allowed to stay, they would destabilize our regime. So they didn't want them. They wanted them to go back to Israel. They also, of course, saw going back to Israel, sending the refugees back to Israel, as the voice of justice. They should be allowed to return to their homes in Palestine. And if we start absorbing them, we'll we'll reduce the power of this claim of justice, that they should simply be allowed to go back to their homes. So they didn't absorb them, and the Israelis wouldn't allow them in. And that's the reason for these are the reasons for the perpetuation of the problem. Now, in terms of policy, what was Israeli or Zionist policy before May 48, Israeli policy from the creation of the State of Israel and the Israeli government in mid-May 1948? And what were Arab policies? Well, the Israelis said that the Arabs, then and later, said the Arabs had caused the refugee problem by their leaders announcing on the radio or calling on the radio for the Arabs to leave. So they were the cause of the refugee problem. Apart from other explanations such as voluntary flight and so on. But they said, the Zionist propaganda said that Arab leaders had called on them to leave. This is untrue. That is, this claim by the Israel and by Zionist spokesmen from 48 onwards, and you can sometimes still hear it from Israeli spokesmen, that the Arabs caused the refugee problem by inviting or appealing or ordering their people to leave. It's untrue. It doesn't have verification in the documentation. There were places Arab leaders told Arabs or appealed to Arabs or advised Arabs to leave, as in Haifa on the 22nd of April 1948. The remaining leadership told the Arab population of the town to leave. But in most places, there wasn't such an appeal or such an order, and Arabs left, not as a result, as I say, of an appeal. We do have documentation, in fact, showing the opposite, that Haj Amin al-Husseini and his people, the Arab Higher Committee, as it was called, did in certain places in East Jerusalem and in Tiberias in March 1948, appeal to Arabs to stay put. And in fact, there were radio broadcasts in May from the Arab world, from Amman and by the Arab Liberation Army from Ramallah, ordering people to stay put or to go back to their homes on pain of confiscation of their property. In other words, Arab leaders telling Palestinian Arabs not to leave or to go back. There were such broadcasts, which is the opposite of what the Israeli propaganda said at the time. But it wasn't consistent, and it's probably true that in April, May, the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs understood that Arab flight would help to goad the Arab states into sending in their armies. So let them flee, because that'll force the Arab states to send in their armies. The Arabs were very hesitant about invading Palestine in May 1948. And if they are dumped with lots of Arab refugees saying, bring us back, defeat the Jews, this would be a massive pressure on the Arab states to intervene. So Haj Amin al-Husseini and his people, as I say, in April, may have understood this, and so there's not many appeals for Arabs to go back by Palestinian leaders, or not to leave their homes. We don't have it, at least the record. We have, I should have said something at the very, very beginning of this talk. We have Israeli records. The Israelis, every Israeli thought he was participating in a great historical moment. They were all very literate. They were all what Israelis call graphomanim. That is, they're all mad about writing things down. Every sergeant, every lieutenant, every captain, every minor official writes things down, sends reports up the chain of commands. He sends reports or orders down the chains of command. We have the protocols of the leadership and so on. We've got the material on the Israeli side. On the Arab side, we don't, because the Arabs states are all dictatorships. They were then and they remain to this day all dictatorships. The dictatorships do not open their archives to anybody, and who knows what's in the archives? You don't know, because you've never seen the archives because they're closed. So we don't know if the Egyptians and the Jordanians and so on kept records. And the Palestinian Arabs didn't keep records because they were disorganized and they were not a state. And things also got destroyed. If there were some records, they were destroyed. There's very little Palestinian Arab material remaining. There's the protocols or some sort of précis of discussions of the leadership in Haifa in January to April. But there's very little Arab records. Very little Arab records remain. So what I'm saying is it's much more difficult to work out what exactly were Arab policies and Arab intentions and so on, also in the pan-Arab invasion of May 1948, and in the Palestinians going to war in November, December 1947, because we don't have their records, and we do on the Israeli side. This is something which has to be understood and should be understood by anybody dealing with any of these subjects. Maybe things will change, the historical picture will change if and when all these records, if they exist, become available. At the moment, they're not available, so you have to take that as a given. So what emerges from this on Arab policy is that the Palestinian Arabs didn't seem to goad their people to leave. There wasn't this policy of getting the Arabs to leave, though it's possible that there was some silence on their part towards the Arab invasion because they wanted the Arabs to invade. The Arab states, their records don't exist, and they were confused. That is, they didn't really know what was happening, and then when they suddenly got this big refugee burden, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs pouring into Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. It wasn't that many, but a certain number by May 1948, they began to see there was a problem emerging, but they didn't really know what to do about it. And anyhow, they were involved in a war. They began to invade Israel. So the Palestinian refugees were a minor issue for them. The problem became acute by the end of the war when there were much larger numbers of Palestinian refugees. And then they began to pressure the Western governments, America, the United Nations, to take back the refugees. But before that, they were involved, as I say, acutely in a war. For them it was a major war against the Zionists, against Israel. So the refugee problem was sort of very minor and not very important to them through most of the war. On the Jewish side, policy and implementation and intent are much clearer. As I said, there was no policy and there's no evidence of a policy of expulsion, not before May 1948, not after Israel is created in May 1948. We have the cabinet deliberations, as I said, we have the general staff, some of the deliberations, we have the Jewish Agency executive protocols, deliberations, and so on. There was no such decision. There was, though, from the beginning of April 1948, when the Zionist forces go over to the offensive, the Haganah goes over to the offensive from the beginning of April 1948, there is an atmosphere of transfer in the country. This is clear, that the Zionist forces, the Haganah, alongside them the IZL and the LHI, which are some minor dissident groups, but have an influence, especially through the attack and the propaganda about the attack in Deir Yassin on the 9th of April 48, where there's a massacre. They had a minor influence, but in general there is an atmosphere of transfer. And why is there an atmosphere of transfer? Because for 4 months the Zionists have endured Arab attack. They've been on the defensive, the Zionists. Now they go over to the attack and they know there's a prospect of Arab invasion of the country by the armies of Jordan, Syria, Iraq, maybe Lebanon. Lebanon doesn't invade, but they think it will, Egypt and so on. They have to finish off the Palestinian armed forces. And the local commanders understand that they'll have a much easier time of it if they throw out the Arabs from their sectors. If they leave a village intact, you can actually invest. You'll have to invest it with a garrison force. You don't have the troops to leave behind in every village. It's much better for you to throw out the villagers, or to see them leave and not let them come back, to destroy, to level the villages. They'll never serve again as bases for Arab attacks on your convoys, on your troops. So the local commanders, by and large, thought it was a good idea for the Arabs to leave, and were happy to see their backs. This is clear. And there was an atmosphere which I think Ben-Gurion also generated, that he would approve of this if this is how the local commanders behaved. But as I say, it never turned into policy. There's no document which shows it, and we have people who are dissidents. We know that in July, for example, 1948, when the Jewish troops, by now it's the IDF, conquers Nazareth, the main town in Lower Galilee, the local commander there, Laskov, wants to throw out the Arabs from Nazareth. And he sends an order to the troops to expel the population of Nazareth. And one of his deputies, his name, can't remember his name, but he's the head of the 7th Brigade, a Canadian volunteer, a colonel from the Canadian Army from World War II, commands this Israeli armored brigade. Ben Dunkelman, that's his name, Ben Dunkelman. He wrote a memoir afterwards. He says to his commander, Laskov, no, I'm not going to expel the population. So it goes up the chain of command, this argument between these two generals, or colonels as they are, but the function of generals. The argument goes up the chain of command, and Ben-Gurion gets the telegram to expel them and from Laskov, and he says, no, don't carry this out. So in certain cases, Ben-Gurion doesn't endorse expulsion. Maybe he understands that once it's spread around the network in the army, he'll be identified as an expeller or a supporter or endorser of expulsion, and he doesn't want to go down in history as such a character in that role. But in general, in most places, he will endorse, as he does in July in Lydda and Ramleh, he endorses the general's desire to expel population. But there are generals who do, and there are generals who don't. That's why in Israel, after the 1948 war, there are 700,000 Jews in the area of the state of Israel as it emerges from the war. There are 700,000 Jews at the end of the war and 160,000 Arabs. There wouldn't be 160,000 Arabs, which is more than a fifth of the population, if there had been a policy of expulsion. All the generals would have simply followed it and done it. Some were opposed, some didn't do it, and there was, and we have records of various Israeli government officials saying there's no policy. One general, one colonel does this, one captain does that, and he was speaking specifically of the Galilee. This guy called Yaakov Shimoni from the foreign ministry goes up to the Galilee. He sees that everybody's doing different things. It's chaos. There's no policy. As I say, there's a will to see the back of the Arabs by local commanders. Probably most of the Israeli population by now is fed up with the Arabs who've been attacking them, Palestinians, and then the Arab states. It's better for the state in the long term to have as few Arabs as possible, but it's never policy. It doesn't turn into policy, and it's not systematic. What else can I tell you about the refugee problem? Let me just summarize, and then we'll leave the floor open for questions. From the records, Israeli, American, British, and so on, but the Israeli and the British are the important ones, the British certainly until they leave in May. The major cause of Palestinian refugeedom, of displacement, is the war itself. And it's the fear of Israeli encroachment and attack, and actual Israeli attack, Zionist and then Israeli attack, which and also fear of staying put and living under Israeli rule. This is the major driving force in the departure. Most Arabs, incidentally, probably think they're going to be coming back to their homes. The Israelis will let them back. The United Nations will engineer their return. The Arab states may invade and win the war and then bring them back. They expect to return. Nobody thinks he's going into a 100-year refugeeedom. They think they're coming back. But the major reason is the war itself and the fear of being harmed and theirs being harmed in the war itself. There's also a breakdown of administration. As Arab areas collapse, as the militias are defeated, as in Jaffa we know in late April, May 1948, people leave because the place is in chaos. There's Arab volunteers who've come and they rape people and they steal things from houses, and the Jews are on the outskirts and the British are leaving or about to leave, so nobody's going to protect them, and they don't want to live under Jewish rule, and there's occasional Jewish sniping. I'm talking about Jaffa in this particular context. So they actually flee the town. They don't see any prospects for continued existence there. There are Jewish expulsions. As I said, in Lydda and Ramleh, there's actual expulsion orders and a systematic expulsion of the population. There are Arab areas where Arabs tell or advise their own people to leave. Haifa is a prominent example of that in April 1948. But in many of the coastal villages and in many of the villages in the north, in the Jezreel Valley, Arab militias and male leaders, muhtars in the villages, often send away their women and children from villages. From December 47, they're busy sending away out of the country or out of harm's way their women and children. The argument is women and children here will be a burden on us if we have to fight off the Jews. The problem is it cuts two ways. Once you send away your women and children, you have less reason to stay put and fight the Jews because you're not defending your women and children. So when they order their women and children to leave in dozens of villages, and we have the documentation for this, this is part of the reason for the creation of the refugee problem. There's also an atrocity factor, which shouldn't be belittled. Certainly from April 1948, when the IZL and LHI conquer the village of Deir Yassin on the outskirts of Jerusalem and kill about 100 of its people, some of them combatants, but most of them non-combatants, and then this atrocity is broadcast on Arab radio stations and other Arab media and inflated. The numbers are inflated, the types of atrocities are inflated. This causes a demoralization of the Arabs in the Jerusalem area and in general around Palestine. And we know that Arabs being attacked by the LHI or the IZL, and even by the Haganah or the IDF, they hear the word Deir Yassin, or they start shouting the word Deir Yassin, and they become demoralized and start fleeing. In other words, the fear of atrocity is very important, and there are a series of atrocities in the war by Arabs as well as Jews, but I'm talking here about Jewish atrocities, which certainly causes panic and demoralization. There's occasional rapes even, and this is a factor which plays heavily in Arab societies for various reasons, and causes fathers and the elders to get their women and daughters and so on out of harm's way. Okay, we'll leave it at that. The floor is open.
Thank you. Take questions?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Can you point toward,
Can I?
can you point toward viable solutions? Are there any? And can you say a word about the concept of new historians in Israel?
Well, I'm an historian, so I deal with the past, so I don't have solutions.
Okay.
So that takes care of that. About the new historians. Well, in the 1980s, when the archives were opening up in Israel and in Western countries about what had happened in Palestine in 48, and a new generation of historians sort of grew up, matured, and I was among them, wrote a number of studies in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, essentially revising the history of what had happened in 48 on the basis of this newly opened documentation, and, if you like, of their open minds, which were different from the minds of Israeli historians in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, who were essentially establishment historians writing official history. And in 1988, I published an article at the end of 1988, sort of summarizing some of the main points of the new historiography, as I called it, and of the new historians, people like myself, Avi Schleim, Ilan Pape, Tom Segev, and one or two others, showing what they had changed, how what they had written changed some of the basic tenets of Israeli historiography about the 48 war and the period around it. And the new historians, in that article, I sort of set them as against the old historians, the official establishment historians, and perhaps I exaggerated, perhaps it was a bit simplistic, that article, but in essence, I think it got it right. That's why it created such a stir, the article and this combination of revisionist histories. I think, if I may say, I think it was successful. That is, the new historiography, the revisionist historiography, was successful to the extent that much of the things which we said had happened on the basis of documentation have been accepted by the Israeli historiographic community. Less so, perhaps, by the public. It takes a long time for historiography to filter down to the public, especially when you've got governments, as we have today, which don't actually insist on the truth about the past. But I think it also had another important impact, the new historiography, in that it forced other historians to write more truthfully about the past. Other historians who didn't necessarily identify as left-wingers or anti-establishment or whatever, but they had to be much more careful about and much more comprehensive about the things they covered. It wasn't just a matter of what they wrote, but it was a matter of what they wrote about. In other words, the refugee problem was something which people didn't write about before my book came out, essentially, except for one exception. And now they were able to write about atrocities. There's a man called Meir, a colonel from the Israeli army, retired, and then he decided to become an historian. And there are some good historians among retired colonels in Israel. And he wrote a history of a particular battalion, the 9th Armored Battalion in 48. He wrote a history about this and was financed by the Defense Ministry, these sort of studies of military units and their history, financed by the ministry and published by the Defense Ministry Press, which is a very large press in the Israeli publishing society environment. And in that history, he wrote about a number of, 1994 this book came out, he wrote about atrocities committed by members of the 9th Battalion in Beersheba and this was unthinkable. 1994 was unthinkable before that the IDF press would publish a book which, you know, detailed Israeli army atrocities in 48. So I think this was sort of under the impact of the new historiography. It made people write more truthfully and more comprehensively about things. Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me, can we wait for the microphone, please? Sorry. Just some recording going on. Thanks.
Thank you. Two small questions and one larger one. Two small questions. Why didn't the Palestinian leadership in 47 or 8 or 48, when the mandate ended, why did they not declare a Palestinian state? Second question, how many Jewish settlers, Zionist Jewish settlers in what we now call the West Bank and Gaza Strip were displaced from their homes as a result of the 48-49 war? And where did they go? The larger question is, if the three chairs to your left were filled by Shleim and Pape and Khalidi, and there's the wonderful Palestinian who wrote Once Upon a Country, his name is escaping me. He spoke at
Raja Shechade or?
They are not.
No, Nusseibeh.
Nusseibeh.
Yeah, it's in the autobiography.
If you were all sitting together at this table, discussing not solutions, not the present, but 48, 49, and the refugee crisis, do you think there would be 5 dead bodies by the end of the discussion, or would you come to some agreement?
Why 5?
Well,
it's like that joke about. Shall I tell a joke? No, it's a riddle. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. It's three snakes. Father snake, mother snake, and baby snake look left, look right, and cross the road. And when they end up crossing the road, baby snake says, "Thank God the 4 of us made it across. The 4 of us made it across safely." Why did you say 4? Sorry, it's because you can't count. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's not there. So as to your questions, yeah. Okay, I'm not going to argue back. It's okay. Why didn't the Palestinians declare statehood, the Palestinian leadership in 48? Well, the Arab states were against that. They wanted essentially, when they invaded Palestine in May 1948, they didn't like Husseini, and they didn't like the Palestinians especially the Jordanians, who wanted Palestine for themselves, not for the Palestinians. They opposed Palestinian statehood, and when they went in, they wanted to share Palestine, the parts they were conquering or about to conquer. They wanted them for themselves. The Egyptians wanted the Negev, the south. The Jordanians wanted the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which they managed to conquer more or less, occupy and conquer. And the Syrians apparently wanted parts of the north and so on. So they opposed Palestinian statehood, and the Palestinian leadership was dispersed. It wasn't in Palestine. They didn't actually stay around for the war. Most of the leaders, lived it out in Beirut and in Cairo. So they didn't really have the opportunity to, and they didn't have the state, I talked about that before, the mechanisms of creating a state. The Jews had prepared the mechanism for statehood throughout the mandate. They'd worked at it. We have to establish this. We want a state, we'll have to establish it, and to do that, you've got to make preparations, and they did it. The Palestinians didn't do it. So even if they had declared a state, there wouldn't have emerged any state, because it was all on paper. It was nothing. There was nothing there. Well, I talked about 70,000 Jews having been displaced from their homes in the course of the war, which included, those 70,000 included some Jewish settlers who lived in the West Bank at the time. There was a bunch of 4 settlements at the Etzion block just south of Bethlehem. There were a few other Jewish settlements just north of Jerusalem, Neve Yaakov and so on. There were 1 or 2 along the Dead Sea, Kalia and so on. And all of these people had been displaced or fled in the course of the war. Those in the West, in the Etzion block were in fact attacked and conquered by the Arab Legion with local irregulars joining them. And they, of course, never came back. And, of course, the Jewish population in the old city of Jerusalem, living in the Jewish quarter, we're talking about over 1,000 people, were essentially expelled by the Arabs, the Arab Legion, which conquered took over the old city and conquered the Jewish quarter in the old city. So that's what happened to them. In 1967, we see the sons of those displaced from the Etzion bloc going back and resettling the West Bank. And these are some of the initial settlers in the West Bank post-1967. You asked about what the Arabs would say about the 48 war. No.
Yes. If you include what Pape and Shalaim and Khalidi and what am I blanking?
Nusaybin. Yeah.
Sorry, Nusaybin. Yeah. If they were together, the five.
Would they kill each other?
No,
No, you
you
did say that.
included.
Yeah, okay, preferably them, but okay, yeah. Yeah.
Or would you find yourselves in general agreement?
Well, about 48, I would say that there would be a lot of agreement. But I would say that Ilan Pape would say that it was in the genes of the Zionist movement to dispossess and expel the Arabs. That's what he would say. Even if there was no plan, even if there was no policy, it was inbuilt into the ideology of the movement. The Arab might say that. I don't think he would. Nusayba wouldn't say that. Sari Nusayba wouldn't say that. But a lot of Arab historians would say, yes, there was a plan. It was preordained and it was systematic and it was implemented, according to a specific plan and so on. They might point to this thing called Plan Dalet, which isn't actually an expulsion plan, but they say it is. But they would say it was planned. In other words, there would be a difference between some of us. But I think Avi Schleim would agree that it just happened. It was war. And nasty things happen in war, and this is what happened. I don't think he would disagree with me on this, and he's actually written very favorably about my books, so I don't think he would argue that.
And Khalidi?
Walid Khalidi,
Rashid.
Rashid. Well, I don't think very highly of Rashid Khalidi as an historian. I think he would tailor what he said according to the politics of the PLO or the Palestinian leadership at the time. In other words, he wouldn't give you his opinion, he would give you an opinion which would be very well tailored according to the drift of opinion in Arab political ranks.
Today or then?
No, today, political ranks today. And the political ranks, the official, the narrative of the Palestinian side is Israelis intended to expel and systematically and on a plan expel. That's the official Palestinian narrative, and he wouldn't diverge from that, in my view. Rashid Khalidi. Yes, there are other people, yeah. Please.
I was just wondering what you say. Oh, sorry. I was wondering, you say there was little expulsion and more just, the war. People fled the war as it was happening because there were atrocities being committed, but that some generals did intend to displace Arab populations, if I'm understanding you correctly. So I'm wondering what the difference is between that and kind of a concrete policy of expulsion. Like if in practice these generals were making targeted efforts or just efforts in general to displace these people, what is the difference between that and a policy?
I think you have to remember that there was a war in 1948. That's what happened. There was a war. They were trying to, they were certainly attacking and maybe trying to destroy the Jewish community in Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs to begin with, and the Arab states' armies afterwards. And that's how the Zionist side, the Jews, the settlers, the people, this is how they saw things. So what happened to the Palestinian Arabs in terms of the generals wasn't that important. They were trying to win a war. And in the process also trying to carve out a little more territory for the Jewish state, to enlarge it beyond what the United Nations had earmarked in the partition resolution of November 1947. So the generals, you know what that reminds me? When I was doing my study the first time in the 80s, I went to see Yigal Yadin, who was the de facto commander of the Israeli army in the 48 war. He was the head of operations, and since the commander-in-chief or the chief of the general staff was mostly sick at the time, a man called Dori, Yadin actually ran the thing. Yadin later became a famous archaeologist and so on. And I asked him, I remember, because I was looking at a particular aspect of the 48 war, I asked him about Lida and Ramle. what happened in Lider and Ramle. Do you know what happened? Can you tell me? This was in the early 1980s when I went to interview him, and I never used interviews at all after that. I thought it's a waste of time. Oral history is nonsense. It's not a basis for finding out what happened anywhere. Maybe it gives you some atmosphere, but it's certainly not a basis for establishing and reconstructing the past. Yadin said to me, I don't remember. I asked him what had happened in Lider and Ramle, where there was the big expulsion in 13th July 1948. And he says, I don't remember. And I said to him, but I've got the records, I've got the actual written orders to expel signed by Yitzhak Rabin, who was the lieutenant colonel at the time, head of operations in that particular operation. And he says to me, this may be true. I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, that there was an expulsion. I just don't remember. Why am I raising all that? Because you talked about the generals. Why did he not remember what happened in Lider and Ramle? Because he was involved in running a war, and a war for survival. And what was happening to a few Arab villages here, or thousands or tens of thousands there, was a minor thing for him in a general war. Later, we, historians, propagandists, commentators, will focus on what happened to the Palestinians, the refugees, that is the civilians. But they were running a war for survival, so it didn't interest them that much. Now, generally, as I said, they preferred a front without Arab villages, without having to worry about them, without having to invest them with garrison troops. But they didn't care that much. Where they fled, and later they wouldn't allow them back. Occasionally, they expelled them, and there were generals and colonels who didn't expel. And that's why in the Galilee, to this day, you've got over 1 million Arabs living there, or close to 1 million Arabs, because the generals in the north, or the colonels, or the majors, or the captains in the north didn't want to expel them, and didn't expel them, and let them stay put. That's what I would say. I mean, I'm sure I can talk about it much more, but yeah, go ahead.
In the beginning, you said that recognizing the refugees now is a large part of the refugee problem nowadays, at the beginning of your talk.
I didn't say that. I said the refugee problem is a major obstacle to peacemaking.
No, you were talking about the children of the refugees being
recognizing
recognized.
them as refugees.
Yes,
Okay.
Recognizing the refugees as refugees is a large part of the problem. And I'm
No, I
just
didn't say it's a large part of the problem. I said there's a problem in etymology or semantics or whatever you call it about who is a refugee. That's what I said. And here we've got a special, a rather unusual, unique, in fact, case in which the world community recognizes second, third, and fourth generations as refugees when it's a problem. They don't do it with other people. Yeah, go ahead. That's what I said.
are they not actually refugees or a displaced population? And is this problem like mostly logistical or legislative? And that is like it's just how you define who's a refugee, or is it like actually? Do you consider them to be a displaced population or not at this point?
It's up to you. I don't consider anything.
I'm asking you what you
No, but
consider.
it's not relevant. Look, many of the refugees have made new lives, have settled down, have houses and lands and so on in Jordan, for example. Are they refugees? They're not really refugees. They live as they're second-class citizens, but they have citizenship and so on in Jordan. So are they refugees? No, they've got passports and so on. In the West Bank, there are refugees, and there are local population which isn't of refugee extraction, and they're not refugees. The refugees there are refugees. Are their descendants refugees? I don't know. It's a matter of perception. And I don't really see the problem. I mean, I don't think that's the problem. The problem is that many of them consider themselves refugees and want to go back to their homes in what is today the state of Israel. That's the problem, not whether I or somebody else thinks they are refugees by proper definition or not. I'm not answering your question.
No, you are.
I am, okay. Yeah, at the back, yeah.
Initially, you said there were 700,000, roughly the UN figure of refugees. And you also said that 500,000 were eventually resettled in Palestine. Did they ever leave?
No, I never said
Did
that.
they ever leave Palestine? How many of them did leave Palestine when they fled?
No, I see what you're saying. There were 1.2 or 1.3 million Arabs living in Palestine, the area of mandatory British Palestine, in 1947. 1.2 or 1.3 million. Of these, some 700,000 were displaced from their homes. 500,000 were displaced to other parts of Palestine, In other words, to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip or East Jerusalem, and a few thousand even remained in the Galilee, but under the status of refugees. And about 200,000, maybe 250,000, were displaced out of Palestine, ended up in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you talk about how the new historians' conclusions have been accepted by the Israeli public or have not been accepted by the Israeli public in what's taught in Israeli schools and their influence on today's Israeli politics and society?
The truth, well, these are very large questions and to which I don't have answers necessarily. I've never studied it. It's something which has to be studied. And it's not something I've studied. I've never looked at what the real impact was. I can tell you some impressionistic things. I think in the schools, by and large, teachers more or less are in charge of their curriculum. Not the state, not the education ministry, but the teachers more or less tell students what happened, or on the basis of certain books, and they select which books they're going to teach. Which not my books, but I mean school books, school textbooks. Some school textbooks I know have absorbed some of the new historiography into their text. Usually they'll say there's this version, which is the traditional Zionist version, and there's this new version by these historians who've recently, that's how, and then it depends on the teacher what he'll teach and what he'll say is the truth. There are many schools probably which only teach old historiography still, certainly in the religious schools, the state religious schools. In the ultra-Orthodox independent school system, they don't teach anything, so they don't know anything about anything. They don't care, and it doesn't interest them. They care about the Bible, or the Talmud more accurately. I don't know. I can't assess the impact of the new historiography on society. Some people at the time, in '88, when the new books came out and the first Intifada began, more or less simultaneously from December 1987, they said some critics of the new historian said, well, they've now sort of helped and reinforced Arab claims and then whatever, and they are in some way responsible also for the new Intifada, for this first Intifada. I think that's nonsense. I think, Yitzhak Rabin in his peace efforts after 1988, after the first Intifada, when he was defense minister, later he becomes a prime minister, he wasn't impelled by the new historiography. He was impelled by facts on the ground, the rising, the uprising, and other international factors. So I don't think it affected policy on large. But I do know from somebody like Yossi Beilin, who was then deputy defense minister deputy foreign minister during the Oslo process in the 1990s, the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. He told me that he had by his bedside a copy of my book with the annotation and so on, and he told his people who were going to deal with the refugee issue to read the book so they'll know what actually happened, not just propaganda. So maybe on that personal level, there's some people who took note of what the new historians were actually writing. But I don't know how much it permeated officialdom and society at large. Yeah. Well, no, you had a question last time. I'll give it to somebody else first. So you'll appear, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have an important question, so hopefully I will get back.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So it's kind of long, so I'm going to read it out. So you consistently use...
Say that again.
I said it's a little long, so I'm going to read it out loud. I wrote it down.
Just ask the question.
Sure. So you consistently use the American government and society's actions as a positive parallel to Israel's actions. You've said before that the great American democracy...
It's a misquote. You shouldn't quote it because it's not true.
I'll finish my question, and then maybe you can comment on it.
What you're going to quote is incorrect. It wasn't said by
So that wasn't a quote. That was my interpretation.
You're going to quote now.
I'm going to
What you're going to
paraphrase.
quote is wrong. I didn't say it. It's a misquote.
Okay, I'll finish my question, and then you can say that I misread it. So you've said before that the great American democracy could not have existed without the annihilation of the Indians, and that because of that, the cruel acts are justified. You've also called Palestinian society sick. You said that Palestinians should be treated like serial killers and that they should be contained. You've also gone as far to say that there's a deep problem in Islam. This is my words now, you've essentially perpetuated acts of Islamophobia and frankly racist remarks that also exist in America. I also don't know any American historian who would say that the expulsion of Native Americans was okay and that expulsion is justified.
I think you've made your point. You've made your point.
Great.
The quote you're quoting about American Indians is a misquote. You can repeat it as many times as you like. You'll actually find my correction to that quote in the following issue of Haaretz when I wrote them an article saying this was a misquote in that interview. You're quoting from an interview from 2002 or something. Most of it is accurate. That particular quote's not true. It's not true. But you can quote it as many times as you like as propaganda, but it's nonsense because I didn't say it. There is a problem in Islam. You're right. There is a basic problem in Islam. I'm answering your question. There is a basic problem. I do believe there is a basic problem in Islam. Most Muslims are not terrorists, but most terrorists in the world today are Muslims. That's a problem. That's a problem. There are certain tenets in the Quran, certain passages in the Quran, which promote anti-Semitism. They call Jews sons of apes and pigs. That's in the Quran. Simple. So there is a problem in Islam. And you don't find many Islamic preachers today who will say, well, no, it shouldn't have said that. It's wrong to say Jews are sons of pigs and apes. But it says that, and many Islamists like Hamas and so on quote that. I wouldn't compare the American case and the Israeli case in terms of the populations. What happened in Palestine in 1948, and I've tried to say this over the last hour in various ways, but you haven't absorbed that. There was a war between two national groups over a piece of land. Two national groups were fighting each other. The Arabs began that fight. If you count from 1947, you can also count, if you like, from 1882 when the Zionist settlers began to come. But from 1947, the Arabs began a war. The Arab national group began a war against the Jewish national group, and they lost the war, and they paid consequences. People pay consequences, unless they're Russia or China, for aggression. There are consequences to going to war. And unfortunately, that was the condition under which a Jewish state could emerge in 1947. And the Jews, in 1948, the Jews lost the war. Perhaps there would have been giant massacres, perhaps not, but there wouldn't have been a state of Israel. So in some way, the creation of the refugee problem was necessitated by the emergence of a Jewish state, given Arab opposition to that partition resolution by the international community. The international community thought it's right to divide the country between the two warring national groups into two states. The Arabs said no and went to war, and the Palestinians ended up without a state and have been offered a state a number of times since and have continuously rejected those offers. That's the situation. It's very unfortunate. Wars cause a lot of suffering. Refugeedom is a perpetual suffering, but that's how history works. I don't know if this answers any of the things you said, but what can you do? Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that during the war, Ben-Gurion was open to refugees returning after the war.
I didn't quite say that. I said Israeli policy officially enunciated was it was open to some form of refugee return after the war as part of a peace treaty.
In the armistice negotiations, to what extent was that part of the discussions? And
it wasn't. Had there been peace negotiations, there would have been some reference to refugee return. And Israel at some point in 1949 agreed to a return. Officially, it said, of 100,000 of the refugees. Unofficially, I would say the number was probably 65,000 because you had to deduct from the 100,000, 35,000 who had already returned. But Israel announced 100,000 were willing to take back. The Arabs said no, and that was the end of the whole subject. That it was never really broached again after 48. Yeah. There's a girl there who, yeah.
My question goes back more to the mandate period, and I know you've sort of implied that the British had a strong part in basically promoting Jewish migration into Palestine, but what was their role in structurally depriving the Palestinians from a leadership that could actually face the Jews? Because once we come into discussing the war, before the Palestinian expulsion, the Arabs were already quite defeated in terms of having established as a leadership within Palestine. So how do you think the British played into that?
This is one of the things written in Rashid Khalidi's book on the subject, which I think is incorrect. he blames the British for the frustration of Palestinian pre-state development in Palestine. In other words, he says the British were to blame for the Palestinians not readying themselves for statehood. The British actually invited the Palestinians to set up a Arab agency for Palestine, like the Jews had a Jewish agency for Palestine, which was the governing body of the Jews in Palestine. They said to the Arabs, do the same thing. Set up an Arab agency for Palestine, which will look after Arab education, Arab this, Arab that, in the Arab population, among the Arab population. And the Arabs refused to do that. In general, as I say, there was a divide between the Arabs who supported Husseini and the Husseini supporting clans and the people who opposed them, the clans who opposed them. And this in some way frustrated, and it led to terrorism by Arabs against Arabs, mostly Husseinis killing Nashashibis. And this frustrated Palestinian efforts to establish a national leadership and national structures. You can blame the British if you like. I don't think the British were to blame. I think the Palestinians were to blame for their own lack of preparation for statehood, which meant that they were unready in 47 to take up what the United Nations was offering, a Palestinian Arab state alongside a Jewish state. The British were supportive of Zionism to various degrees, not stimulating Jewish immigration to Palestine often, but they were supportive of the Zionist enterprise until the mid-1930s. In 1937, 38, 39, they changed, and by 1939 they were anti-Zionist and helping the Arabs, or wanting to help the Arabs, become the masters of Palestine. They began to take in Arabs into their administration as departmental heads in the British Mandate government in preparation for them becoming the rulers of Palestine. But this was all frustrated. World War II occurred. After the war, the British sort of gave up on the whole thing. There was Jewish attacks on the Jewish attacks on British troops. The British threw in the towel and gave the problem over to the United Nations. But it's not wholly correct to say that the British supported the Zionists. They did up to a point, up to 1937, 38, 39, when they switched sides. And the Arabs didn't prepare for statehood. This was really an Arab problem, not a British problem. This is how I see it. I'm sure there's differences about that, I'm sure. Yeah, please.
Okay. So you've stated a couple times that Israel has consistently and until the present been willing to accept partition. I was wondering how you can reconcile that statement with religious nationalist organizations like Gush Emunim or the broader settlement movement in whole.
Well, I haven't spoken until now about the present at all. But you're implying I did. But I didn't. But what I would say is that from 1937 on, the Zionist movement in general was willing to reach a partition settlement of the problem. It's true that from 1977, the Likud, or what it was called something else then, but 1977, the right took power in Israel, and the power of the religious right grew demographically and politically, and they are opposed to it. What I would say is this: they're opposed to partition. They want all of Palestine for the Jews, the land of Israel, as they call it. I would say that in opinion polls among the Israeli public to this day, most Israelis would like a partition settlement, a two-state settlement. Most Israelis, but about 30 to 40% are probably opposed to it. That's my estimate, would be opposed to a two-state settlement. They want all of the land of Israel for the Jews. But I think the majority there's still a majority for a two-state settlement. In theory, I would say that, to add to that, I would say that most Israelis have despaired of a two-state settlement. They may say theoretically they want a two-state settlement, but they know it's not going to happen. They don't believe it's going to happen. And they don't think it's realistic because the Arabs don't want it, because the right in Israel is very strong, for various reasons. The settlements being part of the reasons, yeah. Yeah.
So this is more of a question about your methodology than anything else. You talked about the sources they used being Israeli sources, American sources, British sources. And then you briefly mentioned your distrust of like oral histories.
Yes.
But given that
it was stronger than distrust. The word.
Okay.
Yeah.
Given your rejection,
dismissal
of oral histories.
Dismissal.
Let's say.
Yeah.
But given that a lot of the Arab and Palestinian histories come from those sort of sources, do you not see using those Israeli, American, British sources of sort of writing a top-down history of sorts? And how do you
I don't know what the word top-down means. Historians should rely on written sources. oral history is problematic in the certainly in relation to an ongoing conflict and talking about events which happened 40 years ago. People do not remember anything, basically. After a year or two, people don't remember anything accurately. 40 years on, they won't remember anything, and they will add to that all sorts of propaganda, which other people have told them is what happened, and they come to believe that's what happened. A year after, I'll just give you an example. Citing an historian who actually should know what's going on and remember what went on. Somebody interviewed me in 1983 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, which I participated in as a soldier. I was just a small soldier there. And they asked, the interviewer asked me things about the killing of, what was his name, Bashar, I don't remember, the guy who was supposed to be the president of Lebanon, who was assassinated, Bashar Gemayel. And he asked me about the PLO when it left the town, and I couldn't remember the sequence of events. What happened? Was Bashar Gemayel first assassinated, or did Arafat and his PLO fighters leave on boats before that or after that? I just couldn't remember the sequence, and this is a few months later, and I'm talking about an historian. What I'm saying is that you cannot rely on memory. And certainly you can't rely on people's memories about something which happened 40 years ago, which is still controversial, there's still an ongoing conflict between the people. So they have good reason to remember things in a certain way, or even to lie about what happened in a certain way. So in general, I found also in relation to the conflict over the years, that when you go to the archives and you look sufficiently at the archives, you'll find what you're looking for in terms of material covering a certain event. Let me give you an example. A photographer once came to my house, he took pictures, and he said to me, I have one memory of the 48 war. He was a child of about 10 or something. He'd grown up in the Jezreel Valley, in some kibbutz in the Jezreel Valley, and he said to me, this is 40 years on, and he says to me, or 30 years on, whatever, he says to me, I have one memory of the 48 war, and that is that all the men from my kibbutz one day went out of the kibbutz with their guns and started killed all the animals in the fields. There were lots of dogs and stray donkeys. In other words, animals who'd been left behind by the Arab neighbors who'd left their villages and fled or been expelled or whatever. They left all the animals around, and there was the Israeli side organized, or they were ordered, the kibbutzim, to go kill all these stray animals, presumably because they carried rabies or there was fear of contagion from these animals, and so on. And I thought here, when this photographer told me this, I said, there's something here which I've just learned, which I didn't know about the 48 war, about these campaigns to kill the animals around during the truce days around their settlements. I've learned something new. So I thought maybe there is some value to oral history. But then I decided, well, let me go check the records of the IDF Medical Corps. And I went and looked at the IDF Medical Corps records from 48, and I find, lo and behold, the orders from the regional doctors in the IDF system telling the villagers, ordering the Israeli villagers to kill the animals. In other words, I could have gotten this information from written sources. You don't have to depend on oral sources. Now, there are here and there things which happen, especially, incidentally, massacres, where people don't write down things, because those massacred don't remember, they're dead. And those who do the killing often don't write down the details about what they did for various good reasons. So there are things maybe where oral history can be of some help. But almost always, if you look long enough and hard enough, you'll find written records from the time which you can rely on much more than anything anybody tells you 40 years on. That's what I would say. So I avoid using oral history. And in my new book, incidentally, on Turkey and its Christians, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and so on, whom they massacred in a number of bouts of mass murder over the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, we didn't use any oral testimony. Also, people from then are sort of dead, and what you would talk to was grandchildren of people, what they heard from their grandmothers or something, and it's not of real value. As opposed to written records, which are, in the modern world, you find a lot. It probably would be useful to take oral history if you're doing classical history, if you're doing Roman and Greek history. But unfortunately, there's not that many people you can interview from then, because they didn't leave many records, So, but it's yeah, okay, yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just kind of have a question about, you've mentioned before your disdain for the way that the international community and the United Nations kind of defines the Palestinian refugee. Why do you think that the international community has a special definition for Palestinian refugees as opposed to refugees from the former Soviet Union and other places?
It's not disdain. I think it's a result of the power, the political power of the Islamic and Arab worlds in the United Nations and the various international bodies. They have a lot of power, and they can say, we want them to be recognized as refugees, to get the subsidies of refugees and so on, and the international community is willing to go along with that.
So I use the privilege of hosting you to answer the last question. There two things. One, on oral history. I know that you've opposed that for a long time, and I don't know if you want to answer that specific question, but having thought about it a great deal and having also been trained as an empirical historian in Britain as well, I realized over time that there are events in history, and they include war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, displacement, where if you don't use oral history, you are privileging the perpetrators. If you write the history, as has been done for many decades, the history of the Holocaust, only from the point of view of the SS, the Gestapo, then you get their view of what happened. If you use only their photographs, you get their gaze of what the victims look like. And people who are victims of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of displacement, as you say, often do not have access to documents. They don't have time to write all of that. And so they are victimized twice. First, when they are displaced or killed, and secondly, when they disappear from history. So that's one question. But the second that I've been thinking about during this whole hour and a half is that I think there's something implicit in what you say that you don't spell out, and I'm wondering if you can think about it. That is, what you're saying is that the violence that happened in the war, the displacement, expulsion of Palestinians, was a result of the war, that the main cause of it is that. And yet, at the same time, you say that despite the fact that there was no plan and that there was no order from above, most people, the majority, chose to participate or to encourage the displacement. That is, there were generals who didn't do it. But by and large, if you look at the numbers, the vast majority of Palestinians were gone by the end of the war. And you talk about the mentality that created that. That is, that there was a mentality of displacement long before that, right? That there was a notion of it would be better if
transfer.
We could, of transfer, right? Now, if you take that forward to after the war, then that same dynamic that created the displacement, that created the expulsion, continues. Not only are Palestinian refugees not allowed back right away, but all evidence of their existence is systematically eradicated, which you didn't talk about. So the 400 villages that had been emptied are then leveled. And the memory of that group, and even the existence of there having been once some kind of identity of Palestinians, disappears for decades. And it takes, indeed, until the 80s and 90s that it comes back. That is, that there's a kind of logic, and it's implicit in everything that you say without you actually saying it. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, certainly you're right about post-48. There has been a more or less systematic destruction of villages and the eradication of signs of Palestinian presence, except, of course, you did have 150,000 Palestinians living there who today are 1.5 million Arab-Israeli citizens who continue their lives with their mosques, their culture, and so on. That still exists. But you're right, there was some sort of more or less deliberate effort to eradicate that past, change that past, to bury the village under the trees, as the phrase goes, or what's his name's story tells it. Yoshua, yeah, Aleph Bet Yoshua. That's certainly true. And you're saying that that's in some way a continuation of the expulsion or transplantation or removal of the Palestinians. I'm not sure. I would say that before 48, there was no effort to eradicate the Palestinian presence. There was a Zionist ideology regnant in the Zionist movement. It did not talk about eradication of Palestinian culture, removal, and so on. It just didn't happen, even though there were people who supported transfer of population, which they regarded as dangerous to their well-being. That's for sure. But that didn't exist before 48. The idea of eradicating the previous owners, in terms of the physical culture there. So I'm not sure there's a consistency between the two things. Certainly after 48, that was in place, but I wouldn't look at it as a proof of what was before. Look, you can look at the whole Zionist enterprise, and many Arabs do, from 1881 as an invasion of Palestine with the aim of transforming a land which is inhabited by Arabs. It was never an Arab sovereignty, but Arab habitation, to change it into a land of Jewish habitation by and large with a Jewish majority. That certainly is true about Zionism. And in that sense, you can talk about a Zionist invasion leading up to Arab resistance and various bouts of violence, and the biggest one being, of course, 47, 48, to resist that invasion. But you can also look at the Zionist enterprise as a way of setting up a Jewish state, at least in part of Palestine, and a willingness, certainly from 1937, to partition the land, that is, to have two states, to divide it between the two peoples who have a legitimate claim to it, as the Zionists saw it, even though the Zionists might not say that at the time about the Arab claim to legitimacy, but they did accept it. Weizmann certainly did, and I think Ben-Gurion did, at least in private talks. So you can look at the enterprise in that sense and say they were willing, from a certain point on, bowing to the realities of the situation, to reach partition, and therefore not necessitating eradication or expulsion, etc. But the Arabs always said no. They said no in 1937 to Peel. They said no in 1947 to the United Nations. They said no to Sadat Begin's plan in 1978 for autonomy for the Arabs in West Bank and Gaza. They said no in 2000 to Barak's proposals for a two-state solution. They said no to Olmert's proposals in 2008 for a two-state solution. There's a problem there.
Okay, well, thank you so much.